There's a phrase used in Washington policy circles about Spain. I heard it for the first time in 2004, standing in a corridor outside a NATO briefing room. A senior State Department official was briefing his colleagues, and the door was slightly ajar. He said, "Spain is a predictable ally." It sounds like a compliment, doesn't it? Reliable, steady, trustworthy. It's not. In the language of American power, predictable is code. It means manageable. It means we know how they'll vote. It means we don't need to consult them, only inform them. It means they think they own us. And here's the terrifying part, sometimes they were right. I served as Spain's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2011 to 2016. Before that, I spent years in European institutions, in diplomatic back rooms, in conversations where the real decisions are made, not the ones you see on television. I've sat across from American officials who looked at me with polite attention but unmistakable condescension. I've watched Spanish proposals get nodded through with barely concealed indifference. I've felt the weight of being a Tier 2 ally. And I've spent years asking myself a question that haunts every diplomat from a mid-sized power: how did we get here? And more importantly, how do we get out? Let me tell you how Washington actually sees its allies. They don't say this out loud, of course. But if you spend enough time in their orbit, you learn to read the signals. There are 3 tiers. Tier 1, the indispensable allies. The UK, sometimes Germany, Japan in the Pacific. These are the countries whose phone calls get returned immediately, whose concerns shape policy, whose leaders get private meetings, not just photo opportunities. Tier 2, the useful allies. Spain, Italy, Poland, South Korea on a good day. We're invited to the table. We're consulted, sometimes, but we're rarely part of the real conversation. The one that happens before the formal meeting. The one that matters. Tier 3, everyone else. The coalition of the willing countries. The ones who show up when asked and stay quiet. Spain, for most of the 21st century, has been a Tier 2 ally trying desperately to be treated like Tier 1, while Washington worked overtime to keep us in Tier 2. Why? Because Tier 2 is the sweet spot for American power. We're big enough to be useful, too small to be threatening, loyal enough to be reliable, too proud to be ignored entirely. We're manageable. I remember a conversation in 2012, during the Eurozone crisis. Spain was on the brink. Our banks were drowning. Youth unemployment was hitting 50%. We needed support, from Europe, from the IMF, from anyone. I was in Washington for a G20 meeting. I managed to get 20 minutes with a senior Treasury official. I explained Spain's situation, our structural reforms, our fiscal discipline, our need for temporary assistance. He listened, nodded, took notes. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, "Spain will do what's necessary." You always do. It wasn't encouragement. It was an assumption, a statement of fact. He wasn't asking if we would comply with the austerity measures. He was telling me that we would. Because that's what manageable allies do. I smiled. I thanked him for his time. But inside, I was seething. Not because he was wrong, we did comply. But because of how easily he assumed it. Because of how little our sovereignty seemed to matter in that moment. There was a night in 2003, before I was foreign minister, but when I was already deeply involved in EU foreign policy, that changed how I saw everything. It was during the Iraq War debate. Spain's Prime Minister at the time, José María Aznar, had made the controversial decision to support the US invasion. This put us at odds with France and Germany, and caused massive domestic protests. I was part of a Spanish delegation in Brussels, trying to manage the fallout. The atmosphere was toxic. France was furious. Germany was disappointed. The smaller EU countries felt betrayed. They saw Spain's support for Washington as a rejection of European unity. Late one evening, after a particularly brutal session, I was having drinks with a senior German diplomat. Someone I'd worked with for years. Someone I considered a friend. He looked at me and said, very quietly, "You know they don't respect you for this, right?" I asked what he meant. "The Americans," he said. "They're happy you supported them. But they don't respect you. They think you're desperate for their approval. And the sad thing is, you didn't even get anything in return." I started to protest, to defend the decision, to explain the strategic logic. He cut me off. "José Manuel, I'm not judging the policy. I'm telling you how you're perceived. Washington sees Spain as manageable. They pressed a button, and you jumped. That's not alliance. That's obedience." I went back to my hotel room that night and couldn't sleep. Because he was right. Spain had burned political capital in Europe, alienated our traditional partners, sparked domestic unrest, and for what? A symbolic gesture, a seat at the coalition of the willing table, a photo of Aznar standing next to Bush and Blair. We had been managed, and we had let it happen. Here's how the management actually works. It's subtle, it's psychological, it's devastatingly effective. First, they flatter you. They call Spain a vital ally. They praise our contributions. They thank us for our partnership. Then, they set expectations. Casually, almost as an aside. Of course, we know Spain will support this position. We're counting on Madrid to vote with us. I'm sure the Prime Minister understands the importance of unity on this issue. Then, they wait. If you comply, you get more flattery. Maybe a state visit. Maybe a mention in a presidential speech. Maybe a photo opportunity. If you hesitate, the tone changes. Subtly, there are quiet reminders of shared interests. Quiet mentions of economic relationships. Quiet references to other countries who are stepping up. It's never a threat. It's never explicit. But the message is clear. Predictable allies get rewarded. Unpredictable ones get isolated. I saw this pattern play out dozens of times. And I'm ashamed to say, I participated in it. In 2012, when we were negotiating Spain's position on EU-US trade talks, I received a call from a State Department official. Friendly, casual, he wanted to check in on Spain's thinking. I outlined our concerns: agricultural protections, regulatory standards, dispute resolution mechanisms. He listened. Then he said, "Minister, we really need Spain's support on this." The Prime Minister has always been pragmatic. I'm sure we can find a way forward. Translation: we expect you to fold. And we're reminding you that your Prime Minister's reputation depends on being pragmatic, which means doing what we want. I could have pushed back. I could have said, our concerns are non-negotiable. I could have demanded real concessions. Instead, I said, let's keep talking. I'm sure we can find common ground. In other words, I'll figure out how to sell this to my government. Because that's what manageable ministers do. We reached a compromise. Spain got minor concessions on agricultural products. The US got everything else. Washington was satisfied. They had managed us successfully. Again, why do we do this? Why do mid-sized powers accept being managed? I've thought about this question for years. And I think the answer is more complex and more human than we'd like to admit. Part of it is practical. Small countries need powerful protectors. Spain is part of NATO because we need the security umbrella. We need access to US intelligence. We need the economic relationship. These are real dependencies. But part of it is psychological. And this is the part nobody talks about. Being a mid-sized power is uncomfortable. You're big enough to matter, but not big enough to shape outcomes. You're visible enough to be blamed, but not powerful enough to set the agenda. You're constantly navigating between relevance and irrelevance. So when a superpower pays attention to you, even conditionally, even manipulatively, it's intoxicating. You tell yourself, they're consulting us. They value our input. We're part of the conversation. But you're not. You're part of the audience. I felt this, standing next to American officials at international conferences, being included in briefings, having my phone calls returned. It felt like respect. It wasn't. It was management. And the most insidious part. They make you complicit. They make you the one who sells their position to your own government. They make you the one who explains why this is the best we could get. They turn you into their advocate. Because that's more effective than giving orders. If they tell you what to do, you might resist. But if they make you believe you came to the decision yourself, you'll defend it. I became very good at this. Too good. I could walk into a cabinet meeting in Madrid and present an American position as if it were a Spanish interest. I could frame capitulation as compromise. I could make being managed look like being consulted. And for years, I told myself this was diplomacy. This was pragmatism. This was navigating the reality of power. But there was a moment when I realized I had crossed a line. It was July 2013. Edward Snowden had just revealed the scope of NSA surveillance. And among the revelations was this: the United States had been systematically spying on European allies. Including Spain. They had tapped the phones of European leaders. They had monitored diplomatic communications. They had surveilled EU institutions. The European reaction was predictable: public outrage, private resignation. Germany's Angela Merkel was furious. They had tapped her personal phone. France's François Hollande demanded explanations. And Spain. Officially, we expressed concern. We asked for clarification. We said all the right things. But behind closed doors, the message from Washington was clear: this is not a fight worth having. Move on. I was at home, in Madrid, when my phone rang at 3 a.m. It was a senior American diplomat. Someone I'd worked with for years. Someone who knew me well. He didn't apologize for the hour. He got straight to business. "Minister, I need you to help us manage this." Manage. There was that word again. He explained that the Snowden revelations were damaging transatlantic relations. That this was a gift to America's adversaries. That cooler heads needed to prevail. And then he said something I will never forget: Spain has always been reasonable about these things. We need Madrid to be a voice of moderation, to remind other Europeans about the security threat we all face. To put this in perspective, I was silent for a long moment. Then I said, "You spied on us." on your allies, and now you want us to defend you. He didn't miss a beat. Minister, we both know how intelligence works. This is not about right and wrong. This is about managing the political fallout. And Spain has always been good at seeing the bigger picture. There it was, naked, undisguised. You are manageable, so manage this for us. I told him I would consider his request, that we would discuss it internally, that I would be in touch. Then I hung up. I sat in my study, in the dark, and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, anger. Not just at him, at myself. For how many times had I taken that call? How many times had I managed their problems for them? How many times had I convinced my own government that we had to be reasonable, had to see the bigger picture, had to maintain the relationship? How many times had I been the instrument of our own irrelevance? Here's what Washington doesn't understand. There's a cost to taking people for granted. A cost they won't see until it's too late. Because something shifted in Europe after the Snowden revelations. Something subtle but significant. It wasn't the spying itself. Every intelligence service spies. We all knew that. It was the brazenness, the assumption that we would just accept it. That we were so manageable, so reliable, that they didn't even need to be careful. And it planted a seed. A question that started circulating in European capitals, in quiet conversations, in unguarded moments. Why are we so loyal to an ally that has so little respect for us? In Spain, this question had particular resonance. Because we had already learned this lesson once. In 2004, after the Madrid train bombings, the Spanish public turned decisively against the Iraq War. José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero won the election on a platform of withdrawing Spanish troops. And when he did withdraw them, Washington was furious. There were threats, there were warnings about damaging the relationship. There were suggestions that Spain was abandoning its commitments. But something interesting happened, nothing. The relationship survived. NATO continued. Economic ties remained strong. The sky didn't fall. And Spain learned something important. American power depends on the assumption that they can't afford to lose us. But it works both ways. We can't afford to lose them either. This is the paradox of alliance management. Both sides need each other. But only one side acts like they need the other. After Snowden, I started to see cracks in the transatlantic consensus. Small ones, barely visible, but real. European leaders started talking about strategic autonomy, about reducing dependence on US technology, about building European defense capabilities. These weren't revolutions. They were adjustments, hedges. But Washington noticed, and they didn't like it. Because the thing about manageable allies is, the whole system depends on them staying manageable. If they start thinking independently, if they start prioritizing their own interests, if they start saying, no, the entire architecture of American global power becomes unstable. Let me tell you about a meeting that never made the news. It was 2014. The crisis in Ukraine had just erupted. Russia had annexed Crimea. The US was pushing for harsh sanctions on Moscow. The public story was unity, NATO solidarity, the West standing together. The private reality was more complex. I was in Brussels for an EU foreign ministers meeting. The US had sent a high-level delegation to coordinate the response. The message was clear: Europe needed to align with American policy. But in the margins of that meeting, something else was happening. Quiet conversations, sidebar discussions, European ministers talking to each other without American officials present. Spain, Italy, and France, countries with significant economic ties to Russia, were expressing concerns. Not about the principle of sanctions, but about their scope and duration. Germany was conflicted. They needed Russian gas. They didn't want to jeopardize Nord Stream. The smaller Eastern European countries were demanding maximum pressure. They felt existentially threatened. It was messy. It was contradictory. It was very European. But it was also something new. Europeans discussing their own interests before American interests. Late in the evening, a small group of us, ministers from Spain, Italy, France, and Germany, met in a hotel conference room. No Americans, no official agenda, no press. The French foreign minister started. We need to talk about what we actually want. Not what Washington wants. What we want. It was a simple statement. But in the context of decades of transatlantic relations, it was radical. For the next 2 hours, we had a conversation that would have been impossible in an official setting. We talked about our economic vulnerabilities, our doubts about American strategy, our concerns that we were being asked to bear costs that Washington wouldn't share. I spoke about Spain's energy security, our commercial relationships, our concern that we were being pushed into a confrontation that served American interests more than European ones. Nobody disagreed. But then came the question, what do we actually do about it? And that's where the conversation stalled. Because we all knew the answer, nothing. We would express our concerns privately. We would negotiate minor adjustments to the sanctions regime. We would protect our most critical interests. But ultimately, we would align with Washington. Because the cost of not aligning was too high. Because we were manageable. As we left that meeting, the Italian foreign minister said to me, "You know what's frustrating? They're right. We are predictable, and until we're willing to actually say no, nothing changes." He was right. But saying no requires something we didn't have, an alternative. A different structure, a different system of power, and building that would require us to stop being manageable, to accept conflict, to risk the relationship. Were we ready for that? I didn't know, and I'm not sure I know now. There's a conversation that happens in European capitals. In Madrid, in Rome, in Berlin, in Paris. In diplomatic residences, in late-night dinners, in private WhatsApp groups. It's a conversation about America. Not the idealized America of democratic values and shared heritage. Not the strategic partner of official speeches. But the actual America we deal with every day. And it goes something like this: they take us for granted. They expect us to follow their lead without real consultation. They ask us to bear costs they won't share. They spy on us, then act offended when we object. They lecture us about values while supporting dictatorships when convenient. They demand loyalty but offer only conditional respect. This conversation never makes it into official channels. It never gets said in bilateral meetings. It never appears in diplomatic cables. But it's real, and it's growing. I've participated in this conversation hundreds of times. With Spanish colleagues, with European counterparts, with diplomats who have spent their entire careers managing the transatlantic relationship. And the thing that strikes me is not the criticism. The criticism is old. We've been complaining about American power for decades. What's new is the tone. It's not anger. It's not resentment. It's exhaustion. We're tired of being managed. Tired of pretending that this is a partnership of equals. Tired of defending American positions to our own publics. Tired of the cognitive dissonance between what we say publicly and what we know privately. I felt this exhaustion personally. By my last year as foreign minister, I had become very good at the performance. I could deliver the speeches about transatlantic solidarity. I could praise American leadership. I could project confidence in the alliance. But privately, I was asking myself, how long can we sustain this fiction? Because that's what it had become. A fiction, a story we told each other to avoid confronting the reality that the Atlantic Alliance is not a partnership. It's a hierarchy, and Spain is somewhere in the middle. Not oppressed, not silenced, not powerless, just managed. Part of Spain's predicament is circumstantial. We're not at the heart of European power like Germany or France. We're not special partners like the UK was. We're not existentially threatened like Poland or the Baltic states. We're on the periphery, geographically, strategically, psychologically. This shapes everything. When Spain speaks at a NATO meeting, it's easy for others to tune out. Because what are our stakes? Russia isn't threatening us. China isn't in our neighborhood. The Middle East is important to us, but so is it to everyone. Spain is interested in North Africa, in Latin America, in the Mediterranean. These are our strategic priorities. But Washington doesn't care about North Africa unless there's a terrorist threat. Latin America is their backyard, not a shared concern. The Mediterranean is a secondary theater. So when we try to shape the agenda around our interests, we're politely acknowledged and quietly ignored. This creates a vicious cycle. We can't shape the agenda, so we adapt to someone else's agenda. Which reinforces the perception that we're followers, not leaders. Which makes it even harder to shape the agenda next time. I tried to break this cycle. I really did. During my time as foreign minister, I pushed for Spain to have a stronger voice on North Africa. We had credibility there. We had relationships. We understood the dynamics. I proposed that Spain take a leadership role in EU Mediterranean policy. That we could be the bridge between Europe and North Africa, just as we had historically been a bridge to Latin America. The response was polite interest, but no real support. Why? Because it didn't align with the priorities of the major players. Germany cared about Eastern Europe and economic policy. France cared about maintaining its own influence in North Africa. The UK cared about the Atlantic relationship. Spain's strategic vision didn't fit anyone else's strategic vision, so it was filed away under interesting ideas and forgotten. This is the reality of being a mid-sized power. You can have expertise, you can have insights, you can have good ideas. But if your ideas don't serve someone else's interests, they go nowhere. Here's the question nobody in Madrid wants to ask out loud: what if we stop trying to be manageable? What if Spain said to Washington, "We appreciate the alliance, but we're going to prioritize our own interests, even when they conflict with yours. And if that makes us unpredictable, so be it." What would happen? The optimistic answer: nothing catastrophic. We'd still be NATO allies. We'd still have economic ties. We'd still cooperate on shared interests. But we'd have more autonomy, more respect, more leverage. The pessimistic answer: isolation, economic pressure, reduced intelligence sharing, being shut out of key decisions. Becoming irrelevant. The honest answer, nobody knows. Because no European ally has really tried. Sure, France has its tradition of Gaullism. Germany occasionally flexes its economic muscle. But when push comes to shove, everyone falls in line. Because the cost of not falling in line feels too high. And the benefit of independence is too uncertain. During my time in office, I had moments when I wanted to test this. When I wanted to say, no, we're not supporting this. And we don't care if it makes you uncomfortable. But I never did. Not because I was afraid. But because I wasn't sure I was right. Because the stakes felt too high. Because I couldn't guarantee that independence wouldn't lead to isolation. And because, and this is the hardest thing to admit, I wasn't sure my own government would support me. Because being manageable isn't just about external pressure. It's about internal convenience. It's easier to align with Washington than to forge an independent path. It requires less political capital. It creates fewer domestic debates. It avoids difficult questions. Clannish politicians, like politicians everywhere, are risk-averse. And independence is risky, so we choose managed predictability over uncertain autonomy. And Washington knows this. They count on it. Here's what I believe about the future. The era of unquestioned American leadership is ending. Not because America is weak, it's not. But because the world is more multipolar. Because European confidence is growing. Because the assumption that we need America more than America needs us is being questioned. This creates an opportunity for Spain, for Europe, for all the mid-sized powers who have spent decades being managed. But seizing that opportunity requires courage. It requires a willingness to be uncomfortable, to prioritize long-term strategic autonomy over short-term relationship management. And it requires something else, a vision of what we want to be. Because being unmanageable without a purpose is just chaos. We need to know what we're unmanageable for. For Spain, I believe that purpose is clear. We should be the bridge between Europe and Latin America, between Europe and North Africa, between Europe and the Mediterranean. We have the cultural ties. We have the language. We have the credibility. But being a bridge requires independence. You can't connect two sides if you're firmly planted on one side. And that's the challenge. Can Spain, can any mid-sized European power, develop the confidence to stand apart from the dominant alliance structure while still participating in it? I don't know if we can, but I know we must try. Because the alternative is to remain what we've been, predictable, manageable, and ultimately, marginal. I want to end with this. There's a dangerous assumption in Washington about alliance management. They assume that as long as they maintain the structures, NATO, bilateral agreements, intelligence sharing, the loyalty will follow. But structures are not relationships. Compliance is not commitment. You can manage allies for a while. You can take their support for granted. You can assume their predictability. But eventually, people get tired. Not angry, tired. And tired allies are more dangerous than angry ones. Because angry allies can be appeased. Tired allies simply stop caring. I see this fatigue spreading across Europe. Not in dramatic gestures of defiance, but in quiet adjustments, in hedging strategies, in the slow drift toward strategic autonomy. Washington sees this and calls it ingratitude. They remind us of American sacrifices. They invoke shared history. They warn about the alternatives. But they're missing the point. We're not turning against America. We're turning toward ourselves. And if Washington continues to treat us as manageable rather than as partners, they will wake up one day to discover that their most reliable allies have become their most distant ones. Not because we chose to leave, but because they forgot to make us want to stay. That's the real danger of manageability. It works, until it doesn't. And by the time you realize it's not working anymore, it's too late to change the relationship. Because you've spent so long managing people that you've forgotten how to respect them. I hope Washington figures this out before Europe does. But I'm not optimistic. Because in my experience, empires only learn humility after they've lost what they took for granted. And by then, the lesson comes too late.